Section 49 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 32. Of intellectual apprehensions resulting from the interior impressions supernaturally affected. The sources of them. The conduct to be observed by the soul, so that these apprehensions shall not hinder it on the way of union. It remains for me now to discuss the fourth and last kind of apprehensions, which those spiritual impressions, frequently affected supernaturally in spiritual men, produce in the intellect. Those impressions I have reckoned among the distinct apprehensions of the intellect. There are two kinds of these distinct spiritual impressions. The first kind is the affection of the will. The second, although also in the will, yet because it is most intense, high, profound, and secret, seems not to touch the will, but to have been wrought in the very substance of the soul. Both the one and the other are extremely diversified. The first, when from God, is very high, but the second is the highest, of great profit and advantage. But neither the soul that receives them, nor its director, can ever know their sources, or why God effects them. They do not depend in any way upon good works or meditation, though these dispose us for them. God sends them to whom and why He wills. Sometimes a person who has done many good works will never have these touches, and another of inferior merit will have them most profoundly and most abundantly. It is not necessary, therefore, for the soul to be actually occupied with spiritual things, though that is the better state, in order to be the object of the divine touches, of which these impressions are the result, for they frequently occur when the soul is heedless of them. Some of these touches are distinct and pass rapidly away, others less so, but of longer continuance. These impressions, so far as they come under this description of them, do not appertain to the intellect but to the will. I shall therefore not discuss them now, but reserve them for the treatise on the night, or purgation of the will in its affections, which will form the third book. As in general, and even very frequently, a more express and perceptible apprehension, knowledge, and understanding flow from these impressions into the intellect, it is necessary to mention it here only for that purpose. We must, therefore, remember that, from all these impressions, whether the divine touches which cause them be rapid, or continuous and successive, there flows frequently into the intellect the apprehension of knowledge or understanding, which is usually a most profound and sweet sense of God, to which, as well as to the impression from which it flows, no name can be given. This knowledge comes, sometimes in one way, sometimes in another, now most deep and clear, again less so, according to the nature of the divine touches, which occasion the impressions, and according to the nature of the impressions, of which it is the result. It is not necessary to waste words here in cautioning and directing the intellect, amid this knowledge, in faith, to the divine union. For as these impressions are passively wrought in the soul, without any cooperation on its part, so also the knowledge which results from them is passively received by the intellect. Philosophers apply the term passible to the intellect, independently of its own exertions. In order, therefore, to escape delusions here, and not to hinder the benefits of these impressions, the intellect ought not to meddle with them, but to remain passive, inclining the will to consent freely and gratefully, and not interfering itself. For, as in the case of the successive locutions, the activity of the intellect can very easily disturb and destroy this delicate knowledge, which is a sweet supernatural intelligence, which no natural faculty can reach or comprehend otherwise than by the way of recipient, and never by that of agent. No effort, therefore, should be made, lest the intellect should fashion something of itself, and the devil at the same time effect an entrance into the soul with false and strange knowledge. He is well able to do this, through the channel of these impressions, by taking advantage of the bodily senses. Let the soul be resigned, humble, and passive, for as it receives passively from God this knowledge, so will He communicate it of His own good pleasure when He sees it humble and detached. By so living, the soul will put no obstacles in the way of the profitableness of this knowledge for the Divine union, and that profitableness is great. All these touches are touches of union, which is passively effected in the soul. The whole teaching of this book, on the subject of total abstraction and passive contemplation, whereby we abandon ourselves into the hands of God, is the forgetfulness of all created things, in detachment from images and figures, and dwelling on the supreme truth in pure contemplation, is applicable not only to the act of the most perfect contemplation, the profound and altogether supernatural repose, of which is disturbed by the daughters of Jerusalem, namely good meditations and reflections, if we then attempt them, but also to the whole of that time in which our Lord communicates the simple, general, and loving attention of which I have made mention before, or when the soul, assisted by grace, is established in that state. For then we must contrive to have the intellect in repose, undisturbed by the intrusion of forms, figures, or particular knowledge, unless it were slightly and for an instant, and that with sweetness of love, to enkindle our souls the more. At other times, however, in all our acts of devotion and of good works, we must make use of good recollections and meditations, so that we may feel an increase of profit in devotion, most especially applying ourselves to the life, passion, and death of Jesus Christ our Lord, that our life and conduct may be in imitation of His. Let this suffice for the supernatural apprehensions of the intellect, so far as the guiding thereof through them, in faith, to the Divine union is concerned. I think I have said enough on the subject, for the instructions and cautions already given will be found ample with regard to all that may occur in the intellect. And if anything should be met with a different nature, and not comprised in the distinctions laid down, though I do not imagine that there can be anything which cannot be referred to one of the four kinds of distinct knowledge, what I have said of those that resemble them will suffice. I now proceed to the third book, where, by the help of God, I shall speak of the interior spiritual purgation of the will from its interior affections. This is the active night. I therefore entreat the discerning reader to consider what I write in simplicity and candour, for when these qualities are wanting, however perfect and profound the teaching may be, he will not profit by it, neither will he value it as it deserves. And much more will this be the case in the present instance, because of the deficiencies of my way of writing. End of section 49.